So star positions were used from everything from creating Indigenous calendars to seasonal changes to the availability of food, the availability of shelter. And we're going to talk about all of these right now. Oh, hang on, staying on that slide. So let's look at star positions as indicators of seasonal change. So we see in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities these stars being used for thousands of years to indicate seasonal change. Changes in the sky dictated changes on the ground, right? We see the availability of food sources, when we should collect different seeds, different fruits, medicine, etc. But they also indicated weather changes. If we look to my mob in the Gulf of Carpentaria, one of our wet seasons was over when Scorpius was visible, right? So we could tell that the end of the rainy period was coming when Scorpius was visible. And that this would mean Mari Inga, or dry winds from the southeast, would soon be coming in. The sky also spoke to Indigenous law and customs that helped govern values and morality within communities. And we see just how interconnected this was. If we look to the Pichanchachera peoples of the Central Desert, the start of the Dingo Pup birthing season was indicated by the rising of the Pleiades Seven Sisters star cluster just before dawn. But when Bidem, which is the celestial shark, or what you in the West might call the Big Dipper, when the celestial shark is visible in the evening, Torres Strait Islander peoples knew that it was time to begin planting sugarcane, bananas, and sweet potatoes. But when the celestial shark appeared to touch the horizon, just as the sun sets, Torres Strait Islander peoples knew to avoid entering the water because shark breeding season had started. And that was a really dangerous time to be anywhere near the water. So these sky indicators protected our health, our well-being, our spirit, and they ensured that we followed customary laws, that we had reliable indicators of food availability, and we knew when weather events were coming. For example, the Yolngu peoples of Arnhem Land used the star Arcturus to predict access to Reikea. The Yolngu look for Arcturus to appear just before the sun rises at about 10 degrees above the horizon. So this is usually around late November. And when this occurs, Yolngu mob know that it's time to harvest Reikea. Now, Reikea is a water chestnut. It's got a tuber at the end and it's edible. It's really nutrient rich. It's carb rich. It's really good for maintaining weight and maintaining healthiness. And you can find it across the Northern Territory. It grows to about, a metre and a half tall. As well as being, an edible food source, we use it to create fish traps, baskets, a wide range of things. So we see this position of Arcturus usually occurring during our wet seasons. And this is because the tubers need the water to saturate the soil to help them grow. Now, what's really interesting about this Yolngu story is that stars move over time, right? They move gradually. As the stars orbit the galaxy, their distance to us, and hence their visibility to us, changes. And this affects the brightness of that star. So if we consider that our Earth is also wobbling, right? It's wobbling on its axis. This is referred to, as the precession of the equinoxes. It's this steady change to the way that the Earth rotates on its axis. So this precession means that stars will gradually change the positions that they rise and set at different points of the year. So if we look at Arcturus, if we consider 7,000 years ago, Arcturus would have been in a remarkably different position. It wouldn't have been able to be used by mob to indicate Reikea harvest times. So what this really documents very clearly is that Indigenous astronomical knowledges are continuing, they're changing, they're recurrent, consistent observation. We're seeing the adaptability of these knowledges and the changing of these stories as the sky changes. As our access and visibility of certain indicators changes, so too does our stories. So we would have used a different star to indicate this previously, possibly Antares, which can be found in the Scorpius constellation. It looks like that would have been in a more correct position at the time to indicate rakia harvest times. If we look to the Wurundjeri peoples of northwestern Victoria, they name the western star Arcturus as Marpin Kuruk. The Wurundjeri mob used the visibility of this star to indicate collection times of bitter, which is a wood ant larvae. Now, if you consider the winters that we have here in Western Victoria, they get very cold, and this bitter was an essential food source during these months. So when they see Marpin Kuruk appear during winter evenings, or Arcturus in the west, this is when collection begins. But when they see Marpin Kuruk in the sky immediately after the setting sun, they know to stop eating the bitter and that summer is coming. It's a rather beautiful story associated with this star and with food source availability for the Wurundjeri peoples. And in this story, it associates the star. It says that Marpin Kuruk was a Wurundjeri woman who was desperately searching for food. There had been no rain for so long that the rivers and billabongs had dried up. There were no animals, seeds, plants, or food that could be found for consumption, and her countrymen and women were starving. After a full day of searching for food, she cracked open an ant larvae nest and ate one of the ant larvae. Much to her surprise, she found them very tasty, and she hurried back to her community with as much larvae as she could carry. She saved her people and introduced them to a new food source. After her death, Marpin Kuruk became the star Arcturus. So like we discussed on the previous slide in relation to Rakia, 7,000 years ago, Arcturus, or Marpin Kuruk, would have been in a remarkably different position, so it couldn't have been used to collect ant larvae at that time. And again, this just shows us that Indigenous astronomy knowledges are continuing, they're changing through recurrent and consistent observation, and that they change with the movements of the cosmos. If we look at star position relationships in reference to housing changes, if we look to the traditional owners of Adelaide and the Adelaide Plains, we see this. The use of star brightness to predict seasonal changes. For example, part of the autumn season, known to this mob as Panati, was said to have arrived when you could see the star Pana, or in the west, Fomalhaut, in the morning. This signaled time to change housing, to create big waterproof accommodations which could sustain the yearly rains which fell during this season. So what I'm really hoping to get across in this portion of the lecture is that star position changes had an effect on everything, from weather conditions, food and medicine availability, when was the correct time to collect certain foods, and even on the different accommodations that mob would need to use at different points of the year. So it is such a very complex relationship where the sky governs so much of the behavior that happens on Earth. And again, I keep coming back to this interconnection, the sky mirroring the Earth. For mob across Australia, this was, it was law, it connected, that interconnection of everything is the core tenet of being Indigenous here in Australia. Okay, let's have a look at solstices and equinoxes. So within the field of what we call archaeoastronomical research, there's a large focus on how Indigenous peoples across the world observed sunrise, sunset points, points along the horizon, and how they understood solstices and equinoxes. For us, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and for Indigenous people globally, solstices and equinoxes were important for everything from developing calendars to predicting seasonal changes, for organising certain cultural customs and traditions and rituals. Even in the West, your 4-season calendar is based on this. If we look in the Northern Hemisphere, the vernal equinox in March, if we look at the vernal equinox in March this year, it marks the beginning of spring. But for us in the Southern Hemisphere, it marks the beginning of autumn. There are many well-known sites around the world, Stonehenge, Chichen Itza, and Newgrange, and they were used for the same purpose, for the viewing of solar observation points through stone arrangements or monuments. For us, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob, we use these observations along the horizon for seasonal change indicators and to keep time. But we did it in very different ways to the West. Notably, we don't have 4 standard seasons. We have a range of seasons, sometimes 16, 17, 18. It depends on your location, depends on your environment, the weather systems in your area. And I give a whole lecture, a whole 2 weeks on that in the Indigenous Knowledges unit that we offer here at Swinburne. Now that is a whole lot of content for another lecture that I won't go into in depth, but the differences in seasonal calendars that you'll see through different communities, even communities that exist in the same western states or western borders of territories, even mobs right next to each other will have differences in their calendar systems, in their view of seasonal changes, because it is that exact. Even communities lying side by side will have slightly different weather systems, slightly different food availability, slightly different environments. And so these knowledges were specific and adaptable and retold and regenerated. And again, I'm getting out of, I'm getting too far into it, but that is a lecture for another day. So I wanted to give a little bit of a quick science background because this lecture is for everyone, for the layman, and I'm not an astronomer by any means either. But I'll give a little bit of background science so that we can actually understand the full extent of what it is that we're talking about here. So our solstices and equinoxes, they are defined by Earth's position in its orbit relative to the sun. And this image here on your screen hopefully makes that quite clear. So what's a solstice? There are 2. We have one in June and one in December. In the June solstice, or it's our winter solstice for us in the southern hemisphere, the North Pole is pointing as far towards the direction of the sun as possible, and obviously the South Pole points as far away. In December, during our summer solstice, these positions are opposite. Then what is an equinox? At 2 points during the year, between the solstices, we have 2 positions during our orbit where neither our north or south poles are pointing towards the sun. Essentially, the center of the sun crosses our celestial equatorial line. Now, this is that invisible line that divides our hemispheres. If you've ever looked at a globe in that way, you'll see that line indicated across the globe. During these times, the midday sun will appear directly overhead at the equator, and everywhere on Earth will experience almost equal daylight and nighttime, 12 hours each. During our equinoxes, we experience what those living across the equator experience always, equal night and equal day. So why is this relevant to Indigenous astronomy? Well, because us, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, have been looking at solstices and equinoxes and utilising them in our knowledge systems for literally 1,000 years. In fact, the oldest tradition to do so to date. So what you're seeing on your page is a few images of Wurdi And Wurdi is a stone arrangement on Wathaurong country in Victoria, so somewhat between Geelong and Melbourne to the north of the Youyang Ranges. Wurdi means big hill in Wathaurong. So what you'll see here in this largest image, and the top one perhaps as well, top right hand one, is that Wurdi has about 100 basalt stones. These vary in height and weight, some of them are over 500 kilograms. Collectively, these stones amass an estimated 23 tonnes. And they're arranged in an oval shape 50 metres along its east-west axis. You remember me telling you about my brain problems that I'm having at the moment. Similar sounding words get crossed in my brain, but I hope that you can see this on the image. So Wurdi was used to predict the equinoxes, that time or date twice each year where the sun crosses the celestial equator and where our day and night are approximately equal, and also to predict our solstices, the time or date twice a year where the sun reaches its maximum or minimum declination, marked by our longest and shortest days. Now, this arrangement here is aligned with the Midwest sunset and the midsummer sunset, and Western sciences have shown that these alignments here at Wurdi are accurate to within a few degrees. So think about that for a moment. Accurate to within a few degrees. And this site is carbon dated by nearby sites, right? They're not able to confirm the exact date of this particular stone arrangement, but other Aboriginal stone arrangements in the area date to 11,000 years old. Now, once they can confirm the date of these stones, if it is 11,000 years old, as those who are next to it are, that would make this the oldest observatory in the entire world. So the oldest observatory in the entire world being accurate to within a few degrees. Now, I just think that is truly incredible and speaks just to the scientific accuracy of Indigenous sky knowledges and the way that these knowledges are incorporated into our oral narrative and into the ways, our methodologies, our ways of exchanging knowledges. There are quite a few other sites, again in Victoria, that mark these cardinal points, north, south, east, west, etc. But this is what is expected to be the oldest and most impressive in my mind anyway. So what we're really talking about throughout this lecture is dynamic changes and dynamic knowledges. In each of the slides and everything that I have said, I hope has spoken about the way different mobs use astronomical knowledges to predict changes in seasons, in weather systems, for hunting, for collecting, for eating, behaviours, for the changing of housing. Each of these star stories, songlines, seasonal stories, has an accompanying law and cultural practices. These stories ensure that our laws are followed and engaged with by all members in our communities. So what I really want you to take away from this lecture, aside from the beautiful and scientific nature of narrative Indigenous science, is that what we're looking at here today and what I've discussed in this lecture, and even to an extent what other Indigenous and non-Indigenous astronomers have looked at in terms of Indigenous astronomical science, is that what we have, the information we have, is such a tiny part of the astronomical knowledges that we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have had. And that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we're only just starting to listen and to be interested in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sky stories. It's only in the last 20, 30 years that we're seeing this engagement. And to have, Western scientists look at the complexity of Indigenous narrative and see the complex scientific knowledges that are actually in these narratives. But second, it's that point that I've been making throughout the lecture, that our star positions are constantly changing, gradually changing, due to that wobbling of the rotation of the Earth on its axis and the rate at which change affects this angle, but they're constantly changing. So the stories that we have now are only relevant because they're current. Different stories would have been used, thousands, hundreds of thousands of different stories will have fallen out of use or been adapted to remain relevant, to the sky above us and to practices on the Earth. So even though we have such an expansive knowledge here of astronomy and as it relates, to that interconnection of sky and country and community here in Australia among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and stories, keep in mind that this is such a subset, this is such a small part of the knowledges that would have existed over our 80,000 year history here on this country. So in summary, our stories are never just stories. They're complex knowledges, they're bound in culture and law, and they speak to the interconnection of everything like our culture. It's the earth, the sky, plants, animals, landscapes, waterways. It is all interconnected. And our stories hold intimate knowledges of how the universe functions. how seasonal changes affect the availability of resources, weather and rain indicators, and many more. And I hope I've given you a bit of an insight into that today. Slowly we're seeing, Western science look at our peoples and look at our knowledges and realize that we have had, some knowledges for hundreds of years minimum, if not thousands of years before the West. And that we might have knowledges of the earth, of the sky, that Western science does not yet possess. And so we meet here, at that cultural interface of Western knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge traditions to sort of meet in the middle and pass these knowledges and, move forward greater, broader knowledges that incorporates both. But it is a slow process. It is happening, but it's slow. So hopefully with more time, and we're seeing this outside of Indigenous astronomy sciences as well. Other Indigenous knowledges are slowly becoming integrated and being looked at, as being possible saviors of current problems. Sorry, my dog is snoring in the background. Current problems that we see, if we only have to look at climate change and things like that, or Indigenous fire farming, for example, and the place that could play in reducing fire risk in Australia. We see it in the Northern Territory. Our councils engaging with Indigenous knowledges as they relate to land management, allowing cultural burns, allowing fire farming, and with that reducing the overall risk of damaging, destructive fires. And we saw those, ravage parts of Eastern Australia just before COVID began in 2020. And so again, I'm getting off topic, but I'm hoping that I'm sharing that we have such complex knowledges and scientific knowledges that could really change, the way things are conducted in Australia, but also globally with Indigenous peoples globally, those knowledges, not just climate change and sustainability, but health and that view of things as being holistic and interconnected. That could go a long way. And so I hope in your lives you look to engage with Indigenous knowledges where you can, and think about them as being vital and incredibly scientific and where they can assist. I've popped a quote in here by Norris, and it says, "We're all used to Aboriginal art, didgeridoo and dancing, and often people don't appreciate the depth and complexity and intellect that goes into Aboriginal stories." So I hope I've shown a bit of that today. And I really hope that you've enjoyed this lecture. I hope I've shown that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples use our narrative and our storytelling not only to transmit knowledges, but to make sense of complex science as it relates to what happens in the sky and what happens here on Earth. So that is the end of my lecture today. I'm so sorry, my dog is snoring so loudly in the background. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, you can find me at egavin@swin.edu.au. Flick me any questions that you might have on Indigenous narrative science, or Indigenous astronomy or Indigenous knowledges, anything that you like. I look forward to hearing from you. Some references for this. Thank you very much.